Good afternoon. My name is Father Christopher. I'm here with my Capuchin brothers today, and I'm going to reflect just briefly on the silence of St. Joseph, his interior life, and the graces that flowed from that. Brother Diogo touched on a few points, I think, beautifully, but I'm going to go a little bit deeper into that topic. One of the things I learned this past week, reflecting on the life of St. Joseph, is we don't have any recorded words of him in the New Testament. So a lot of what we say about him comes to us through tradition and to our devotion handed down to us throughout the centuries. We see prefigurements of Joseph in the Old Testament through the patriarch Joseph, but we really don't have any concrete data about Joseph's prayer life. But it's clear he was a prayerful man. He had very few words to say, but he's always in the background. Think of the Nativity. He's always kind of off to the side, or even in our chapels. He's somewhere, very silent, very prayerful, wrapped as a strong man in faith. One of my favorite stories about St. Joseph comes from one of my own confreres. He's a chaplain, in the best sense of the term, to the Missionaries of Charity in Denver, Colorado. And if you've ever worked with Mother Teresa's sisters or their group of women, they have a very, very strong devotion to Mary. And right in their chapel is the Blessed Sacrament, the tabernacle, and then Mary right off to the side, usually in an image just like this. But in the chapel in Denver, St. Joseph is way out in the hallway, way down from the chapel. And so one day, Father Regis gets up and starts preaching on the Feast of St. Joseph. And he starts in his homily crying like a little baby. And he asks the sisters very kindly, he says, "Sisters, do you hear the baby crying?" And they said, "Yes, Father." They said, why do you think he's crying?" I said, "We have no idea." They said, "Well, because Jesus wants to be with his mom and his dad. So we need to bring him in the chapel, And so they kind of laughed and giggled. But Joseph is one of those saints that shows up in the New Testament in a very powerful way. And so I want to talk about three forms of prayer in Joseph's life. Number one, meditation. Number two, contemplation. And this more mystical type of prayer called practicing the presence of God. Okay? So I'm going to try to do that for us today. One of the things that came into my own heart, into my own mind, in my reflection about when did Joseph become a silent, prayerful man? Maybe we might guess at the Nativity, when his divine son, the God-man, was born, or maybe when the angel spoke to him and said, "Flee to Egypt," or there might be a couple places where we could point to say that this is when Joseph began to develop the habit of prayer. But the more and more I reflect on it, remember, Joseph comes from the Old Testament, right? And in the Old Testament, anytime that somebody's life is dramatically changed, there's usually a theophany, right? What does that mean? Think about Abraham when the three visitors showed up and revealed to him that he would be the father of many nations. Or Moses, right in front of the burning bush. It's a great example of a theophany. And to Moses was revealed the divine name, right? I am who am. And he was changed. He changed his direction. He changed his way of life, right? And many times all throughout the Old Testament, Ezekiel, the great prophets, Daniel, right? The three youths in the furnace. There's a theophany. God, this transcendent God, breaking through human history and choosing a human instrument for a divine purpose. Well, to me, I think Joseph had that, right? Now, it happened in a unique form. It happens in his dream. And he has a theophany of an angel. And that angel tells him that he's going to be a father. He's going to be a father of a unique child, the promised child of old. One of the most important theophanies in our biblical story or in our salvation history. In fact, it's the most next to Mary's theophany, right, with the angel Gabriel. And so, to me, I think that's when Joseph learned to be a silent, prayerful, respectful of the transcendent man, right? Even after Moses sees the burning bush, he's very, very careful about how he approaches God. And I think That's where Joseph begins this experience. And think of your own lives, right? Have any of you ever had a profound conversion experience back to maybe the Catholic Church? Maybe there's some of us in here who have been faithful from the moment we were baptized, but I certainly had that Theophany moment in college of discovering the real presence of the Eucharist and the truths of the Catholic Church, the grace of the sacrament of confession, of God's transcendent love for me breaking into my human heart. And that changed me, changed my direction, my trajectory. Okay, so that kind of thing is what I want to point to. Okay, but notice how that kind of aha moment, that transcendent moment, becomes lesser and lesser. And I think this is how God works. God works from the extraordinary down to the ordinary, right? As we get older in the spiritual life, oftentimes we want God to do the extraordinary. We want the fireworks in our prayer, right? But oftentimes God works in the silence and the ordinary. Think about the baby once Jesus is starting to maturate, right? Mary's nurturing him, he's growing. Joseph has to carry him, teach him how to walk, teach him about the animals, teach him about the world, right? Those are ordinary things that families do every day, right? But I don't think he had that same profound aha moment that he did in his dream, that he did watching Jesus run around Nazareth every single day. I'm sure he had to pause in his own heart and ponder, right? We hear that about Mary. Mary pondered these things in her heart. I'm sure Joseph had to do the same thing, right? This great mystery of God becoming man, he had to ponder. But as I was listening to my brothers preach, I made the connection that we do the same thing. God is that close to us in the Eucharist in an ordinary way, right? In the form of bread and wine. And how often during the Mass or how often throughout the week do we have to ponder how God comes to us in that form? It's not this huge, magnificent trumpets, blasts, and angels manifesting, right? We believe that by faith that it's happening, right? But our human senses perceive just the ordinary. And I think Joseph had that daily experience, that daily grace of seeing Jesus in his midst, right? And he had to be a prayerful person to accomplish that, to achieve that. So how did he do it? How did he remain in a prayerful, silent disposition? Well, in our Catholic tradition, we have, like I mentioned, the two traditional forms of prayer, meditation and contemplation. And recently, my own stepfather has been growing in his spiritual life. Maybe this Lent was extraordinarily good to him. But I had a blessed opportunity to have a car ride with him a few weeks back, and he asked me, he said, I'm really desiring to pray better as a Catholic, but I'm finding out that I don't know how to pray. How do we pray as Catholics? What's the difference between meditation and contemplation? How do I put this into practice in my own life? And my stepfather is a very, very business-oriented man. He's in construction, so he lives a very busy life. And first of all, I affirmed him in his desire to pray. That's already a sign that God is working in his midst, just like Joseph, right? So anytime we have a desire to pray, we should rejoice, right? Because that's the Holy Spirit moving in our hearts, leading us to this work. Now, the first stage in prayer that the Catechism tells about is the stage of meditation, right? And what is that? Well, that's basically the work that we in our human lives do to think about God, or to think about divine revelation, or to feel what it might be like at the Nativity, right? We can use our imagination, we can use our memory, we can use a rosary, something along those lines, okay? But before we begin that human act, we have to commit to it, okay? We have to set apart a period of time, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, maybe a half hour. For us friars, we do it an hour daily. We have to commit to that period of time and be in a place and make an act of faith that God is with me in that committed time, okay? That's when meditation begins, right? And all the work that we do, everything that we do to bring to that committed time of prayer is called meditation. Okay? So maybe we bring the scriptures for the day. Maybe we bring the Word Among Us and read the meditation. Something along those lines, okay? And the spiritual masters tell us that usually in that period of meditation, it's us talking to God. We're telling God what is going on in our lives, what we're experiencing from that thought that we're having, or that feeling that we're having, or that image that we're holding in our minds. Okay? And many of the masters tell us that we have to be engaged in this form of prayer for years, right? Years, before we even can be prepared for this great grace called contemplation. And I think we, in our Western world, are very pragmatic. We want results. We want, rapid results, instant gratification, right? But I've been in religious life over 10 years, and I just feel like I'm learning how to pray. Right? So don't give up on your meditation, is what I'm saying. And I told my father the same thing. Be very patient in your meditation. Trust that God is there with you, loving you, listening to you, helping you. Okay? So that's the first. The second is contemplation. This great grace in the mystical life, right? Examples of my own prayer life that encourage me are Padre Pio, right? A great contemplative. Mother Teresa, another great contemplative. Solanus Casey, wonderful contemplative man, right? But I love, as a Capuchin friar, to look at the elderly friars in the community, or for those of you who may know other communities, contemplative communities, look at the elderly sisters or brothers or priests in those communities. They have, I think, the grace of contemplation, generally by their demeanor, their habit of speech, by how they present themselves in the world, how they say Mass. There's clues that you get that they're in this mode of receiving God. It's a very, very beautiful grace, okay? And that's what Joseph is doing in his life. He knows that God is going to continue to speak to him. He believes that God will continue to reveal himself in Jesus, and he has this attitude, open heart of hearing, listening, and receiving. Okay? Mary is very gifted at this too. But that's contemplation, right? That's the work God does. We leave it up to him. And in fact, it's a great mystery on when it happens and how it happens. But it's going to happen the more we open up ourselves to it, okay? But here's the final thought about contemplation. One of the things I'm learning in my classes at the seminary, one of the great prayer masters in our tradition, St. Bonaventure, he tells us that God created us in the Garden of Eden, right? In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were created. But the word Eden means the garden of delights, or the garden of pleasure, right? So we in our human nature were created for delight, for happiness, for pleasure. But St. Bonaventure builds on the system of St. Augustine and goes on to say that in Christ, man was created for the highest delight, or the highest pleasure, which is to rest in the arms of the crucified Christ. Right? So what am I saying? I'm saying that in our prayer lives, in our contemplative experience of God, we can find pleasure. And in fact, the highest pleasure that's available to us in our human nature. You know, I used to work with a lot of military folks back where I'm from. There's lots of Army bases and Air Force bases and all sorts of things. And so I met a lot of adrenaline junkies. Or talk to an ER doctor or a nurse. They're kind of in that genre of being an adrenaline junkie. And you talk to them and say, why do you do what you do? And a lot of them have that need to have that feeling alive experience, right? That high of looking off a cliff and skydiving or something, which I would never do, But they enjoy doing, right? Or jumping out of a plane, a C-130. They feel that human experience of feeling alive. Right? But the masters, and I think St. Joseph felt this, he felt fully alive, fully satisfied, fully fulfilled, looking and contemplating in silence the mystery of God and Jesus. Right? That's what we want. That's what we're after in prayer, okay? Finally, my final thought on, mentioned a third category of prayer. St. Joseph was also a great worker. Some of our brothers already commented on his habit of work, right? And a lot of us, most of us in this room, I think, have full-time jobs or have this need to be in a state of work, right? And so a lot of people feel the tension between, well, I want to pray, but I have to work, etc., okay? And even us as friars, we don't spend the entire time in chapel. We have other things that we're doing, right? But there's a great grace, I think, that's found in our tradition. Comes from a Carmelite writer. His name is Brother Lawrence, right? He was a cook in the kitchen, a lay brother, and he wrote a little book on prayer called Practicing the Presence of God, right? And Brother Lawrence is well advanced in this stage of meditation and contemplation that I've already articulated. But the brothers need him to cook. And if you've ever spent time in a monastery, it doesn't go very well if there's not a cook, because the brothers have to eat. Some of us more than others, right? But Brother Lawrence learned very, very quickly that Jesus not only dwells in the Eucharist, but he dwells in his human heart, right? And he can commune with God. He can experience God. He can feel God. He can talk to God just as much as he could in the chapel as in the kitchen. And that's what St. Joseph understood, right? I think he was so self-aware of the vastness of God's presence, that God was present in God's only begotten Son, right, Jesus of Nazareth, in front of him in human flesh, 100% God, 100% man. But St. Joseph was also aware of God in his human heart, in his human nature. And he developed this habit. It's a habit, okay, of being aware of where God is. Wonderful, wonderful stuff, okay? All of this, I think, was achieved through Joseph's silence. Joseph's silence, his contemplative heart. So now for us here, are we silent? Do we have enough silent, prayerful space in our lives? I hope so. You all took time out of your day today to spend time with prayer. Continue to do that. Maybe once a month, every day if you can, just a little bit of listening, right? Is Jesus present in your prayer life? If not, talk to somebody about that. Figure out, find somebody that can mentor you in prayer, or that can teach you some of the tricks of the trade. Read the saints. Read the spiritual masters. Be familiar with the successes that they had. Okay. Finally, are we silent in our relationships with others? Do we let others speak first? Do we have a habit of gossiping or backbiting, right? St. Joseph doesn't do any of that. I want to leave you with a very interesting quote I found by Cardinal Ratzinger, who also has, Pope Emeritus Ratzinger, or Benedict, right? Pope Emeritus Benedict. But he has the namesake of St. Joseph. I totally forgot about that. Tage mentioned that today is the anniversary, the 30-year anniversary of Pope Francis being elected. But Joseph Ratzinger also has St. Joseph as a namesake. And he says this about St. Joseph's silence. I want to leave us with this quote, this idea, when it comes to looking to Joseph to model for us this contemplative, this meditative, this practicing the presence of God in our own lives. His, meaning St. Joseph, is a silence permeated by contemplation of the mystery of God and an attitude of total availability to his divine wishes. Let us allow ourselves to be infected by the silence of St. Joseph. We have much need of it in a world which is often too noisy, which does not encourage reflection and listening to the voice of God. My brothers and sisters, we have the grace today in this reflection to have a few moments of silence. Let's take a few of those moments now and speak to God from our hearts, but also Let us listen to the voice of God, to hear what he's saying individually to each one of us. Amen.